Britain has suspended free trade negotiations with Israel in its strongest rebuke yet of the ongoing military campaign in Gaza. Addressing the House of Commons on Tuesday, Foreign Secretary David Lammy called the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, quote, abominable, and described Israel's military tactics as dangerous, repellent, and monstrous. Lammy accused the Israeli government of enforcing a starvation strategy, citing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's comments that only the bare minimum of food should be allowed into Gaza, just enough to prevent hunger, end of quote. Well, let's bring in international journalist Adeniyi Kunnu, who joins us from Chicago, while a policy analyst, Dr. Victor Okhai, joins me from Lagos. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us to take a closer look at this story. The threats of sanctions on Israel are not new, but to see the UK willing to suspend trade deals with Israel is quite a thing. How significant is this shift in UK support for Israel? I'll start with you, Mr. Kunnu.
That the level of humanitarian crisis is enough to make any human being with blood flowing in his or her veins to actually to cry out. But another thing is you cannot look at just one side of the conversation, because it is easy to look at the carnage, to look at the death and destruction for some people, but to look away from what prompted this is what I'd not like us to actually talk about. We know that a couple of years ago, the Palestinians actually attacked Israelis while there was a music festival. And oftentimes you never can tell what is going to be the extent of the reprisals you have when such an attack has gone. And it hurts me to my bones to see that children who cannot fight or defend themselves, vulnerable women, and of course, you're talking about young children, apart from, the babies here, have been terribly affected. But when you look at what the United Kingdom has done, it appears as if some other countries that are known as natural allies, effortless allies of Israel, are beginning to rethink their partnership. We're talking about the free trade talks. We're talking about refusing to send about 30 out of 350 ammunition to the United Kingdom to continue to prosecute the war. You're also talking about the position of the European Union with regard to this. But one thing that I'd also like us to have the West talk about is the fact that Hamas has not relented. We know without a doubt that the bombarding of Gaza and many other places around that region is unbearable, and the proportion is actually indescribable. But anytime they're having a conversation about Israel stopping or Israel discontinuing the kind of thing that is happening in the Gaza region, it is important for them to talk about Hamas itself, the need for Hamas to stop. Because they're not relenting, please. Yes, please.
Before I go to Dr. Okhai, Adeniyi, just hear me out on this one. You mentioned the amount of suffering that we're seeing in Israel now. That suffering has been there since it began. So what suddenly changed the UK's position on this issue is what everybody is asking. Why the shift now?
The reality is this, and I need us not to get it wrong. I sympathize with those who have been killed in Gaza, but much more than the emphasis on the despoliation of Gaza and the destruction of lives and property, let's also remind ourselves that Israel has also suffered a certain level of casualty. But for me at this point, even if it is obvious for all to see that the Palestinians are suffering more, it is also important for those talking about creating more or less like prevention of further destruction to also try to speak to the issue of what is happening from the side of Hamas. It's a terrible thing happening out there.
I get
that.
And
I tell you, I don't know how many more years it will take them to recover from this
Let
destruction.
me bring in Victor now. Israel's foreign minister says this decision will backfire on UK's economy. What are the trade-offs for the UK?
Okay, no, let me get your question again, please.
Israel's foreign minister says, well, this is only going to make your economy worse, so you can go ahead and do your worst. What are the trade-offs for the UK?
Well, for the UK, first let me attempt to answer the question you asked my dear friend and brother Kunnu earlier on about what has changed in the UK's position. I think it is obvious now that the European Union and the UK have, since Trump came in, have found out that it's no longer business as usual. In the past, as allies, they will blindly support whatever the US supports. But now they are willing to look at things through clearer glasses, not foggy glasses of blind support and loyalty, as they have always done in the past. So what has simply changed is the fact that there's a Trump right now who is no longer, I mean, America may be their friend, but Trump certainly is not. And so right now, they are willing to look at things more critically rather than support blindly. And in terms of trade in their relationships with Israel, all that is being redefined right now. I think they have since found out that, you know, it's time to begin to look beyond the U.S. because, again, it's about Trump, the Trump factor. It's no longer the way things used to be. So for them right now, they are willing to look at other trade partners, look at other relationships, redefine, you know, the kind of relationships they have always had in the past, which for Trump, as far as Trump was concerned, was parasitic because it seemed to have been only one way, and now it's no longer business as usual.
Right.
Let every man, you know, find his way, and that's exactly what's happening right now.
And to your point about this growing body of European countries coming together to threaten Israel, do you see a unified Europe against Israel? Do you see that's ever going to happen?
Well, again, the Europeans cannot pretend to be even saints at this time. You remember that anti-Semitism has always been there. I mean, if not for America, it still is there. It's always there. In fact, wherever, I mean, Europe, you saw that during the World War, they were always against the Jews. You remember the massacre and, you know, what happened in Auschwitz, where they were gassed as well. So it's just bringing back things that were suppressed in the past, you know. So it's not going to be new. It was just the American factor and the fact that America was a benefactor to Europe as a whole and was protecting them, you know, as part of NATO, you know, against attacks from countries like former USSR, now Russia, and its allies. So Israel was never really like a friend to Europe as such. But what held them together was just the fear of America, what they were benefiting from America. America was dictating how things were going.
Adeniyi, the conflict in Gaza has obviously resulted in unimaginable humanitarian crisis. What steps do you think the international community can take at this time? Because obviously the threats they've issued in the last 2 years has really not done anything so far.
I think you must understand that the West understands where hypocrisy is and untruth. If you actually check, my brother Victor said something there. He was talking about the relationship between Israel and Europe. Let me say this, and it is important for the world to understand, that but for America, perhaps we won't have a country called Israel today, which has been existing since 1948. And that is more or less like a seemingly eternal connection between them. So whenever we talk about the way forward, it is for Europe to actually stop anything that is hypocritical in how it deals with certain people in certain blocks of Europe, and also to look at the need for it to stand on the ground and mediate as fairly as possible. We know that this has been an intergenerational conflict that we may not see the end in sight. But what Europe can do right now is to reduce the level of carnage of unimaginable proportions that everyone is witnessing at the moment. So right now, if the UK and the European Union must come to the table, they must come to the table as fairly as possible so that Israel can understand that the role it is playing to reduce the carnage is actually unhypocritical. Except that I do not know what we'll do. But at the moment, I think the UN must also hold a position that is superior. You're talking about the body that actually has over 180, 190 members. It is important for the United Nations to also act its role and not be like it is dangling like a pendulum when it comes to people's lives. When we gather, when they have their sessions, the UN Secretary General has to speak to this issue strongly and ensure that no side misunderstands the position it's old, not playing to the gallery. So until these unhypocritical positions are held and proper conversation are had, and there's a deliberate move by the superpowers, as it were, to mediate properly, unhypocritically, impartially, I think that we may still have long negotiations ahead of us. But I hope the end to this trouble is in sight. I have to say that.
I was listening to an analyst earlier who said there can never be a unified Europe with Germany's current stance on the issue. Germany is unequivocal in its support for Israel. Dr. Okhai, how do you respond to that?
Okay, so Germany finds itself in a moral quandary where whatever it does can be misunderstood. And so, you know, it cannot afford to go against Israel, even if it wants to, so that it does not appear to be anti-Semitism. They have had that for so long that they want to get rid of it. Then let me quickly talk about the UN. There's very little the UN Secretary General can do, and the reason is because if there's an undemocratic institution, it is the UN. Let me explain what I mean by that. It is an institution that is governed or ruled by a minority. And among the minority, it is the minority vote that counts the most. What do I mean? At the Security Council, where you have 5 permanent members, it takes 1 to veto. And that veto will override the remaining 4 countries. So what it simply means is a rule of the minority over the majority. And so there's very little that even the UN Secretary General can do unless there's a unified voice. And unfortunately, the minority at the highest level will always have not just its say, but also its way. And in this case, it is what America says in one instant, or what any of the others may say if America goes another way. And that's the way, unfortunately, it's been structured. Until there's a change, I don't think that the UN has. I think it will just be a toothless move there.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there tonight. International journalist Adeniyi Kunnu, who's joining us from Chicago, and Dr. Victor Okhai, a policy analyst, joined us from Lagos, I believe. Thank you both for joining us tonight.